Hey guys, welcome. This will be one of two lectures that I'm going to give you guys this week. I'm going to make them two short and sweet ones, but it's going to cover some good content, I believe. Welcome to Effective Leadership or Leadership Principles, and I'm quite excited about this topic, and I hope that you are as well. You can see my little background here. I'm actually in the cafe of our Awakening base, which is outside of Budapest, Hungary. And above here is where my daughter and her husband live. And we also have a floor that we have set up with a bedroom here. My daughter and son-in-law will be moving from here probably in November, but that's going to allow me to continue to come and base out of here when we're doing our Eastern European work. And so I'm grateful to have a bed to sleep in and a place that's here, and I am enjoying my papa or grandpa life. And so appreciate your guys' prayers. I am hoping that you're getting energized for this new class coming up and getting into this next season. Some of you are still catching up on the summer work, and if you've heard from me, it's all good, no worries. I know some of you have some legitimate issues. I do want to take a moment and just highlight a couple things as we start into this class. We're going back to the normal routine where we're going to be having weekly assignments. Things will be posted on WhatsApp from you guys as well. And in addition to that, we will have two DBAs, discussion-based assessments, and two cohort classes. Now, I haven't posted yet the course syllabus because I'm waiting for the university to give their thumbs up on what I submitted to them. And then I will post that with the class expectations that will have all of the dates that you need to know, particularly considering the starting and ending date and when I'm proposing the DBAs and the cohort meetings. I want to remind you that the DBAs, many of us are doing it in a group setting, which I certainly think it improves the quality of that time together. But you can schedule those one-on-one with me, the discussion-based assessments. And so that is just a little bit of flexibility if you need it. I know that most of you like doing it as a group, but I want to just differentiate between that and the cohort classes. The cohort meetings are usually a guest speaker that comes in. All right. And so this is going to be a 7-week course. I've taken 1 week off to extend the class at the other time, and I will be slowly posting your essay information. My goal is to have that to you in the next week and a half. I'm not posting it now because I'm still filtering through that. Plus, some of you guys want to get started way early, and I want you to get some of the content before you start making decisions about that. Let me just go ahead and start off saying that there are a lot of seminary students that we have encountered over the years, particularly in Belgium, that do an amazing job when it comes to understanding the word, communicating the word, and can go very deep in the word. However, I find that a majority of them, and I honestly mean the majority of them, have a difficult time leading. We have an expression in America, and all of my American friends will probably recognize this, but there's an expression that says they could not lead their way out of a wet paper bag. And you know how paper gets wet, it's soft, and that they couldn't even lead themselves out of that. And I find that to be true. A lot of guys really struggle in the leadership part. This class is going to be talking about how to develop an effective leadership, how to develop yourself to be an effective leader. And I want to just base a couple things. We're going to borrow from DCPI. We're going to borrow the 3-dimensional approach to leadership. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But it's basically the 3 things are simply this. You have to know yourself. How does God design you? What has he made you? What is your dynamic? What is your strengths? What are your weaknesses? You have to know the stuff. Too much is given, much is required. There's a leader that I consider a very dear friend who told me a long time ago that I'm just not good at administration and his church is in total chaos. Well, if God has given you that responsibility, then much is required. And therefore, you either have to operate in your strengths and develop your weaknesses, which in his case would be administration, or you need to get people surrounding you, which is the better option, who are strong in administration, but you can't micromanage them. You have to empower them to make the decisions that they need to make and to function and their strengths, which is your weakness. So my point is this: as a leader, you have to determine, okay, because I'm not good at it is not an excuse. You either develop it or you find someone else that can do it. Give them the authorization and the power to do it. And then the third thing is this, is maturity. And maturity is always connected to our intimacy with God. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but those three things, in addition to 5 truths about leadership, is what this whole class is going to be built around. Now I'm going to share a screen with you guys, and so that we can go over my notes. I will post these notes in the Neo platform for you guys to look at, and also feel free to use them on your own if you ever want to. There's no copyright on it. Let's define leadership real quick. All right. We all know John Maxwell. He said that everything rises and falls on leadership. He's absolutely right. And I'm sure in all the countries that we come from, we represent we can look at our government structures in those countries and say it's absolutely true. When the leadership is quality, when the leadership is good, when the leadership is godly, the nation flourishes. When the leadership is low, when the leadership is selfish, when the leadership is corrupt, the nation suffers. So it's absolutely true. He says, John Maxwell, that leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. Stephen Covey says this: leadership is communicating to people their worth and potential in a way that is so clear that they come to see it themselves. Now, you guys might know this leader, Bill Schwartz. This is the BS version, all right? Bill Schwartz says that leadership involves using one's influence to improve the quality of life of others. Isn't that true? We are here to add value. We're here to improve the quality of life of others. So if you're mentoring other leaders, you're helping them get to the next place. If you have a new believer, you're helping them mature in Christ. If you have someone who's in poverty, you want to elevate them to a place of stability. So I truly believe that this is a great definition for leadership. When we look at the biblical examples of leadership, I love Ephesians 4:11-13, as it talks about the fivefold ministry, because it not only signifies the individual roles, that the individual names, apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastors, and teachers, but it also tells us what their function is: to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. I want you to see here is that these leaders are to elevate others. They are to elevate others. That's what leadership is. Leadership is not about elevating ourselves. Leadership is about elevating others. And it says that this is to be done until there's the unity of the faith with the knowledge of the Son of God. And we talked about that before. That's why I believe these fivefold ministries are still functioning today. Not really a topic for this discussion, but just another pen in that thought, okay? Because there is no unity in the faith, all right? The 5 leadership foundations that we can see from this text, the 5 leadership foundations that we see here. And that is simply this: leaders are always intentional. Leaders have to be intentional, not only in the way they lead, but the way they lead themselves. Because you can never lead others until you lead yourself. So your leadership growth has to be intentional. Your leadership decisions have to be intentional. Your leadership planning has to be intentional. Your empowerment of others, it has to be intentional. What I'm trying to say, leadership does not happen by accident. It has to be intentional. Leaders add value to others. Again, focusing on that point, our job is not to elevate ourselves as leaders, but to elevate others. And leaders add value to others. What value can you add to the lives of those that God has put in your life to lead, to develop, and encourage? Leaders do the hard things. Leaders make the difficult decisions. Leaders, they deal with the hard topics that people struggle with. Leaders have to let people go. Leaders have to be willing to let people go. Leaders have to make hard decisions that are not popular. Leadership is not about a democracy. I'm going to say it again. Leadership is not about a democracy. When Moses tried to lead the children of Israel out of the desert by democracy, it did not work. So leaders do the hard things. Leaders continually grow. You don't go to Bible school. You don't get a master's degree from New Covenant and say, I'm a qualified leader. Leaders have to have a growth system. And this is something that I'm even being convicted about myself, because a lot of my preparation right now is teaching, working with you guys in the cohort who are world-class leaders, but also 22 students at our local Bible college. And we can get put into a trap when we neglect our own development because we're trying to develop others. A preacher should not only be reading the Bible to prepare for a message. We have to have a relationship with the Word. Leaders should not be focusing on leadership development only when they're trying to develop others. They should be focusing on developing themselves as well. And the fifth point is this: leaders produce other leaders. Isn't that the fruit of a leader? Is to produce other leaders. Now, I want you to see this with these above statements: being intentional, adding value, doing the hard thing, growing, and producing others. This is what we're going to focus on throughout this entire class. The three-dimensional approach to leadership. This is something we've learned in CPE. All of us should have taken it by now. And that is those three things that I mentioned earlier: your personality, ability, and maturity. The personality is discovering yourself. What are your strengths? How are you wired? Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? I'll never forget when I was preparing to become a missionary and we had to go through a psychological evaluation. One of the greatest parts of that evaluation was when we sat down with the counselor, the psychologist, and she sat down and she said, "You will not be the typical missionary. If you are not leading efforts and taking on new challenges and taking on new fields, you're not going to be long-term. You're not a guy that can sit idle. You have visionary status in your life. You need to move forward." That was so helpful for me because I was coming out of an associate pastor position where my drive was to help the pastor to have his dreams become a reality. And so I realized there had to be a shift at that point. That was a part of me discovering who I am. When you discover who you are, then you can major in your strengths. Your responsibilities might cause you to develop your weaknesses, as I mentioned earlier, but you want to be able to focus in on your strengths. Learning the stuff. Once you discover who you are, once you discover where your strengths are at and what God has built you to do, then you have to sharpen those tools. A good athlete does not make a good basketball player. All right. There are guys that are just naturally gifted. Listen, I spent decades coaching basketball. There are guys that are naturally gifted in basketball, and then there's guys that are just really good athletes. So they still have to develop the skills. In both situations, the skills have to be developed, and a leader, remember, is always growing. And then spiritual growth. Spiritual growth is the point and the time that they are developing intimacy with God. Sorry, I got a little distracted there. They're developing intimacy with God. And when our intimacy with God is developed, then we're confronting ourselves, our weaknesses. We're confronting ourselves, the places that we need to grow. And I want to encourage you guys, everything is going to be based on your intimacy with God. I was preaching this weekend and I was reading from that text that says to take up your cross, deny yourself, take up your cross, and then follow me. And as I've been reading through scripture over the last couple of years, I really have been taking notice at sequence in the order of things, the way that they are said. And I find it interesting that Jesus told his disciples, number one, first step, deny yourself. Number two, second step, take up your cross. And number three, follow me. Notice that follow me wasn't the first step. The first step was deny yourself. The second step, take up your cross, meaning die to yourself. You can't live in him unless you die to yourself. Then follow me. So unless you're willing to deny your desires, die to yourself, you'll never be able to follow him. Well, I think that's the same thing when it comes to maturity with Jesus, is that our understanding ourselves and understanding the stuff is never going to be effective until we have intimacy, and we're never going to have intimacy without knowing him. And when we know him and have that intimacy, then the areas of our life have to be developed. And we know what happens if any one of these three things are missing. If any one, it either leads to moral failure, because you know yourself, you know the stuff, but you have no intimacy with God. It leads to frustration because you know God and you have skills, but you don't know who you are. Anytime that any of those things are missing, something is going to go wrong. And let's make it a goal in this class that we grow in these three areas: knowing ourselves, learning the stuff, and developing intimacy with God. And I want to end this session with these thoughts. If you'll read Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, and 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. This is where in Acts, deacons were selected, leaders. In Timothy, where bishop and overseers, the qualifications were shared at that point, and the qualifications for elders in Titus. This is something so profound as I begin to read this past week. When you see these three qualifications, the only place you'll find in the New Testament where leadership qualifications are being spelled out. This is what a leader must have. And in Acts chapter 6, they were to be men that were full of the Spirit and of good reputation. And in Timothy, it begins to talk about their domestic life as well as their spiritual life. But it also said in there that they must have the ability to teach. And in Titus, again, it talks about their moral, spiritual, and domestic life. Out of all of those qualifications, some of them overlap, some of them are different. Only one was based on talent. Only one was based on skills. And that was in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, about bishops and overseers, that they had to be able to teach the word, to divide the word, to communicate the word. All the other qualifications that are mentioned in these three passages, these three texts that deal with qualifications for leaders, all of them were about the moral, spiritual, and domestic responsibilities of the leader. I think that is so profound, in my opinion, that when we look at scripture and it talks about the qualifications for a leader, that only one qualification is about skill. All the other qualifications deal with the spiritual integrity, with the character of God, with the way they lead their household. So every leader must have a spiritual, moral, and domestic qualification. Spiritually, that is their vein, right? And their spirituality is going to impact their morality. And the morality is going to impact the way that they live their lives domestically, the way that they take care of the home. The reflection of the home is always going to be a reflection of how they lead their organization. The way they lead themselves will always be a reflection of the way that they'll lead an organization. Let's be men of God, women of God, who are going to be focusing on our relationship with Him. Let's learn to lead ourselves first, and let's see what God does with that. All right. I hope this encourages you guys. The next video is going to be talking about humility, pride, and the habits that we need to develop in our life. Remember, make sure you take notes, send those notes in, and you can make this part of one of the video responses that you have. Your video response is simply what impacted your thinking throughout this week's learning. All right. Appreciate you guys. Have a great week. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.